So today's video is going to be part 3, the finale of the Death House Landlady, Dorothea Puente'S House of Horrors. If you didn't catch the first 2 parts, I'll put them both in the little eye, so make sure you've watched both of those before you watch this one. You need the full story. But if you are up to date on parts 1 and 2, I'm just going to give a quick little recap in the beginning of this one, and then we'll jump straight into the rest of the story. So Dorothea Puente is a 60-something-year-old woman who's done prison time for drugging and robbing people before, but since her release, she's been up to much, much worse. A whole 9-victim murder spree. These 9 victims included her best friend Ruth, her fiancé Everson, and 7 of the tenants at the boarding house she ran. Although the police have no idea about any of these murders, they believe that Ruth's death was a suicide because she died of drug overdose, although her children do actually suspect Dorothea, and they have told police and they've tried to get them to look into it, but the case was eventually ruled a suicide. As for her fiancé Everson, police don't even know that he's dead. They've found his body, but they don't know that it's his. This body has remained unidentified. And his family have no idea either, because they live all the way in Oregon and they think they've been writing letters to him, although it's been Dorothea that's been responding. As for the other 7 tenants, no one knows that they're dead either. Dorothea just simply dug holes in the backyard, buried them there, and then made up some excuse as to why they'd left. And part 3 picks up the story when one of the surviving tenants at the boarding house asks a police officer if he can meet him away from the boarding house because he had something to tell him. This tenant told the police officer that he heard banging in the middle of the night, and it sounded as though someone was dragging something heavy down the stairs, perhaps a human body. And the officer sat and listened to this tenant telling him that he believed that Dorothea was killing all of her tenants one by one, and he took all of this information back to the police station and handed it over to the homicide unit. So the first order of business for the homicide team was to familiarise themselves with Dorothea Puente, get up all her records, have a look, see who she is, what she was about, what she did. The main homicide detective that we're going to talk about in this case is John Cabrera. He was like the main guy on the unit. I don't know official police terms, but he was like the leader of the homicide team. So he gets on the system, he types in Dorothea Puente, and sure enough, all of her criminal history comes up. Her extensive criminal history. He learned that Dorothea, at that current moment, was still on probation for drugging and robbing 2 different victims on 2 different occasions. He also found that she used to have a boarding house once before in the past, before her prison sentence. However, she'd had that boarding house taken away from her because she was stealing her tenants' government checks. So what was to say that she wasn't doing that right now? Immediately to John Cabrera, everything just seemed weird about Dorothea Puente, even down to her age. She would tell people that she was in her 70s, but on file, it said that she was 59. So John Cabrera wasted no time investigating both Dorothea and the house, the whole boarding house situation, because it was clear that something wasn't right here. He was specifically concerned about the fresh holes being dug in the backyard. So Cabrera and 2 or 3 other officers assembled a team and went to 1426 F Street to go and speak to Dorothea on November 11th, 1988. And surprisingly, Dorothea was unnervingly calm. It was very odd. This was a team of 4 officers at her door, and she knew damn well that she was a serial killer. And she was almost cocky in the way that she was answering questions. She wasn't afraid to answer any questions. She never flinched once at any of the questions. And when they asked to search the house, she was more than happy for them to do so. So the team began searching the house. And what they were really there for primarily was Burt Montoya. He was the missing person, the person that Judy Moyes was very concerned about. That was why they went to search the house in the first place. So they're looking all over the house for some kind of sign of Burt Montoya, be it him alive, his body, his belongings, anything he left, anything that could, point to where he was or what he was doing missing. They weren't really planning on finding his body so much, like looking under beds and in closets, because he was a big guy and it would be kind of hard to hide, a big 6 foot whatever man in a closet without anyone finding him. They found absolutely nothing in the whole house relating to Burt Montoya. However, what John Cabrera did find was 2 pill bottles in Dorothea's bedroom. One that was empty and one that was full to the brim of sleeping pills. So he was looking at these pill bottles and he realised that the empty bottle was prescribed to a woman named Dorothy Miller. And, of course, that wasn't Dorothea Puente'S name, so why was that pill bottle in her possession? Of course, we know that Dorothy Miller was one of Dorothea's victims. She'd gone missing from the boarding house one night and Dorothea had murdered her. However, when Cabrera asked, Dorothea said that Dorothy Miller was one of her relatives who had recently come to stay at the boarding house and just probably left that pill bottle behind. So the homicide team searched the whole house and they found pretty much nothing. Other than that pill bottle, there was nothing there. And so before they left, they asked Dorothea if they could dig up the yard in a few places, just to check there. And Dorothea said yes, she was, willing for police to do whatever they wanted to do, but she asked why. And so Cabrera said, oh, well, we've heard a couple of stories about how there's holes dug in your yard often, so we just want to check out what's going on there. And Dorothea said, yeah, okay, that's fine. She even offered them another shovel because they'd only brought 2 and there was 3 of them, so she offered them another shovel. So they set out digging in 3 different sections of the yard and they were going for about 40 minutes and they still hadn't found anything. And that was when one of them began digging up pieces of cloth. One of the pieces of cloth was like a section of like a blouse material or like a nightgown, like a very thin piece of cloth. And then another one was like a piece of leather. And so, they seemed to be getting somewhere with it. And so they continued digging until they hit a tree root under the ground. So then the other 2 that were digging in other places of the yard came over to this one and they all tried like digging out this tree root, like moving it out of the way so they could continue digging. And so John Cabrera got down into this hole and he grabbed it with his hands and he was just trying to like pull it and wiggle it with enough force to dislodge it, and then it came loose. He pulled it with so much force that he actually fell back into the hole behind him, and when he looked at this object in his hands that he thought was going to be a tree root, he realised it wasn't a tree root at all. It was a human bone. So the team all kind of look at each other and they're like, you're seeing what I'm seeing, aren't you? But they decide not to go and tell Dorothea just yet. They wanted to carry on digging and see if they found anything else. And sure enough, they found the rest of the remains of this human being. So John Cabrera goes and gets Dorothea from the house and brings her outside and points into this hole and just says, look. And she looks and she's suddenly acting really shocked and really surprised and really scared and nervous and saying, oh my God, what? How? So now the homicide team realised that they'd just stumbled across something very real. And of course, they were just detectives. They weren't properly trained to handle and dig up dead bodies. And so they decided to pause it there and get a CSI team in. And the CSI team's job for the next few days was to dig up the whole of the yard around 1426 F Street and, properly examine anything that they found. So the CSI team began the recovery of that body that John Cabrera's team had found yesterday. But as they were looking at it, they realised that this was a woman, an elderly woman with grey curly hair. And bear in mind, they were only looking for Burt Montoya. They didn't know that anyone else was dead or that anyone else was even missing at this point. They were there because Judy Moyes had gotten in contact about Burt Montoya being missing. And if they were going to find anybody in the garden, they expected it to be Burt Montoya's. So they'd just found the body of an elderly woman that they were not expecting to find. And now they realised that this case was going to be way bigger than they originally imagined, and so they just continued digging. They continued digging the whole yard. And it was at this point in the case that Dorothea goes up to John Cabrera, who was actually helping dig in the yard with the CSI team, and she goes up to him and asks if she is under arrest officially at this point. And Cabrera said, well, no, not right now, but if you'd like to come down to the police station, they'd love to give her a lie detector test just to kind of rule her out for the most part. Not fully rule her out, but get a good idea of whether she was telling the truth or not. And she said she was way too anxious to take one that day, so anxious that it had probably come out wrong anyway, but she was happy to take one the following Monday. In fact, she said she was so anxious right then that she needed to get away for a minute. She just needed to get away from 1426 F Street and all the press and all the investigation, and she just needed to clear her head. And so she asked Cabrera if it was alright if she could just go for a walk to the end of the street and meet her nephew at the hotel and just have a coffee with him and just sit there for a while the investigation was going on. And for some unbelievable reason, they said that she could. They deemed her not a flight risk and said, yeah, okay, sure. Bear in mind, a human body, human remains had just been dug up from this woman's garden, from a shallow grave, and they're like, oh yeah, sure, you're not going to be a flight risk, go for a coffee. And so John Cabrera escorted Dorothea Puente through the rows and rows of media and press outside of her house and to the hotel at the end of the street. He left her there and then he hurried back to continue with his digging. So Cabrera runs back to 1426 F Street and continues digging with the CSI team. And he must have only been digging for another 20 minutes or so when he hits something else. This time it was a leg. Still in jeans, still in a shoe, it was a man's leg. So immediately the whole team begins panicking. They've just recovered 2 different sets of human remains. This is not an accident, and they're probably connected. They're probably connected to each other, and they're probably connected to the resident at the house, Dorothea. And so they're talking to each other saying, well, where the hell is she? We need to arrest her now. And that is when John Cabrera had to confess to the rest of his team that he had let the main person of interest in this investigation go off for a coffee by herself. So Cabrera continued digging with the CSI team while another officer ran to that hotel at the end of the street to see if she was still there. He was there for about 10 minutes and then the rest of the team received a signal on their radio. It was that officer, and Dorothea had taken off. And it was then that Cabrera realised that Dorothea was definitely guilty of something because she'd waited until that exact moment to ask to go for a coffee, until John Cabrera was just 1 foot above this body. He was almost there with his digging, and she'd noticed that, and she wanted to get away. She did not want to be there when they discovered that. So police began the process to try and track Dorothea down, but where do they even start? Where could she be right now? She could be anywhere. She'd been gone for about 20 minutes, so she could have travelled relatively far. And it wasn't long at all until they found yet another body. This time it was wrapped up in a bunch of blankets and a bunch of cloth and then a layer of plastic, and then it was all taped up. Like, this body seemed to have been wrapped up way more than the others that were literally just dropped in the holes and filled over. So it seems in retrospect that this body was probably one of the earlier killings when she was a lot more careful. She was a lot more meticulous. She took a lot more care with her victims. The search of the garden would take a number of days to complete, and so in the meantime, other police officers were working on other sides of the investigation, trying to figure out where these bodies had come from. So a number of them went door to door, speaking to Dorothea's neighbours on F Street, asking them if they'd ever noticed anything, heard anything, you know. One of the neighbours said that they had noticed a very foul odour coming from 1426. However, Dorothea explained it away, saying that she'd just laid out some fertiliser in the yard and that the smell had be gone in a few days. One neighbour also showed police a box of items that he'd recovered from his garden that morning, and he believed that all of these items, there were about 15-20, he believed that they were human teeth. And it just so happened that he found them in his garden on the morning that the CSI investigation began. That's not a coincidence. It was very likely that Dorothea knew that she would probably be caught or discovered that day, and so she was just trying to discard of any evidence that she had around the house, especially any evidence that would identify her victims. So police got in contact with social workers to put together a list of all the tenants that had stayed at the boarding house over the last however many years, so they could go down this list and just follow through with every single tenant to see if their family knew where they were, if there'd been any kind of medical records of them over the years, and just see how many of them had gone missing. And when Cabrera received this list back from the social workers, he was looking down it, and one name that jumped out to him in particular was Dorothy Miller. Now, if you remember, when he and the rest of the team were first searching the boarding house, he found an empty bottle of pills belonging to Dorothy Miller. And when he brought that up to Dorothea, she told him that Dorothy Miller had been a relative of hers that was staying over at the boarding house, and she must have just left that pill bottle behind. However, of course, now that was seeming very unlikely, and now they were starting to question why Dorothea had lied about that. She was obviously covering something up. As the investigation went into its third day, there was still absolutely no sign of Dorothea Puente, and police were doing everything they could to still track her down. They got in contact with people working on the Mexico border to kind of keep an eye out for her, and if they did see her, if she was trying to cross into the border, then they had to obviously hold her. Because if you remember what I said in part 1 about how after she'd drugged and robbed Malcolm Mackenzie, she bought a one-way plane ticket to Mexico. So it was clear that she'd tried to flee there before, so there was nothing saying that she wasn't going to try that again. Meanwhile, back at the boarding house, they were still digging and searching in that yard, and 2 more bodies were found on the 13th. And at that point, that made for 5 bodies being recovered from the backyard of 1426 F Street. And at this point, none of them had gone for autopsy or been identified or anything yet. However, it was very clear to the CSI investigators digging them up that these bodies had been killed over different periods of time. Some of them were more decomposed, some of them were eerily fresh. Some of the bodies they were digging up were pretty much just bone, like that first one that they found, but some of them seemed to have only been dead only a matter of weeks, showing that whatever had been going on here had been going on for a very long time, flying under police's radar. And as all of this was hitting the news, in real time, police were being contacted by all sorts of people that claimed that they had even more leads for them to follow up on. And one of these people, or should I say an organisation, was a local halfway house. Now, if you don't know what a halfway house is, neither do I, really. I don't actually know if they have them anymore, but it's kind of like a step between prison or jail and normal everyday life. It's for people that have just finished their sentences and they're on parole, but they've been in prison so long that they kind of need to reintegrate into society. So I think they stay at the halfway house overnight, and then during the day they'll go out and they'll get jobs, they'll pick up work, they'll socialise and kind of get that bit back before they're just kind of let out into the world and just got to adapt to real life again. So this halfway house got in contact with the police, and they said that they believed that they could help in this investigation. They had a little bit of information because they knew that it wasn't Dorothea that was digging all of those holes in her own garden, because it was their parolees that were digging those holes. Dorothea had paid these men who were looking for work to come and dig holes in her garden on the premise that she was doing some renovation or, putting new features in. This whole time, everyone in the community thought that she was a saint because she was helping out the community. These parolees would struggle to find work because of their criminal past. A lot of businesses and companies wouldn't let them work there. However, Dorothea was giving them that work and that pay that they needed. However, in reality, the only reason that she was choosing parolees to do this rather than doing it herself was because, she was kind of old and she couldn't do all that physical labour herself. She needed someone else to do it. And the reason that she chose these parolees over, any other kind of labourer that could have dug the holes for her was because who were these parolees really going to tell about it? It had never come up in conversation for them because they're not integrated into that society. They don't have friends that know Dorothea or go to the house. Their only friends are at that halfway house. And as well, because they kind of stay at the halfway house and they only come out to work, they'd never notice if anything was really happening with those holes. If she told them to dig these holes so that she could do some kind of garden renovations and then the next week the holes were just filled over, then they'd get a bit suspicious. But of course, they're never going to see that. And specifically, one of these parolees in particular wanted to sit and speak with police because he was just now realising that maybe he had unknowingly had a hand in covering up these murders with Dorothea. Basically, Dorothea had asked this man if he could do her a favour that seemed innocent at first. However, once he realised that 5 bodies had been found in her yard, he was now realising that it wasn't so innocent. This parolee told police that Dorothea had asked him to call Judy Moyes pretending to be Burt Montoya's uncle from Utah that he was staying with. Dorothea told him it was because the social workers were visiting too much. She just kind of wanted them off her back and to give her some peace for a bit. And so he agreed to do the call and make it sound as though he was Burt Montoya's uncle and that Burt was fine, not knowing that Dorothea had already murdered Burt. The next day of the investigation, police ripped down a shed that was in the yard of the boarding house, and what do you know? They found another body under there, making it 6 now. And once they felt like they dug up pretty much all there was to dig in the backyard kind of went down the side of the house and then down the back, and they'd pretty much dug the whole thing. They decided to move on to the front yard. There was just a bit of a patch of grass out in front of the house, and they began digging in there, and once again they found one more body, which was the final one that they found, making the total 7. But this last body, the 7th, was the first one that the CSI team had come across that was mutilated. All the other bodies were still found pretty much whole, and if they weren't, then that was because of decomposition. But this was the only body that had the hands cut off, the feet cut off, and it was decapitated. There was no head. So we believe that this body, the last one to be found, was actually the first one to be killed. The first tenant to be killed. Of course, she murdered Everson and Ruth before that. However, Betty Palmer was the first tenant that she murdered, and because it was her first and she realised that she was going to bury Betty on her own land, she wanted to make sure that Betty's body would be unidentifiable. So she cut off all the prints and, of course, her head, where she could have been identified through her teeth. And Betty Palmer's hands, feet and head have actually never been found. Cabrera says that they could well be on the property and they just hadn't found them that whole time. Or maybe Dorothea had, disposed of them, discarded of them somewhere else. During this investigation, police actually got a tip-off from one of the neighbours on F Street that said they'd actually seen Dorothea digging in an empty lot across the road. There were plans to begin the construction of 2 houses on that lot in the coming months, and so it makes sense if there's going to be 2 houses built there anyway, and no one's ever going to be able to dig it up ever again, then it makes sense that she would bury bodies there. The CSI team moved over onto that empty lot and they were digging for a while, but they didn't find anything over there. Absolutely nothing. No sign of any other bodies, no sign of the rest of Betty Palmer's body. Unfortunately, the rest of Betty Palmer's remains were never found, and Dorothea never told anyone, never so much as hinted to anyone where she'd disposed of them. Meanwhile, all the searches were still going on inside the boarding house. All of the boarders that were still there when all of this came out were moved out into temporary accommodation, and police went in there and they recovered over 300 separate items of potential evidence. This included pill bottles, books of different kinds of information. There was one book all about different types of drugs, so they believed that that was what Dorothea used to kind of educate herself on what drugs could kill people, what doses could kill people. They took cuttings of the carpet from the death room because, like I said, bodies would be in there so long that bodily fluids would soak through the floor, into the carpet, into the woodwork, and, that was evidence. Police got in contact with whoever kind of ran and managed the government benefits system, so whoever was giving out the money for pensions and disability allowances, all of the money that Dorothea's tenants would be receiving from the government that she stole. And they basically just asked for a list of everyone that had claimed benefits at that address, at 1426 F Street, for the past however many years. And it wasn't surprising that pretty much all of the benefits that were being claimed to that address were under Dorothea's name somehow. And the most shocking thing is that benefits were being claimed at that address from people that didn't even live there anymore, from people that hadn't lived there for years. James Gallup, Vera Faye Martin, Dorothy Miller, Leona Carpenter, Betty Palmer, all still somehow claiming for checks at that address. And none of them had been seen for months, if not years. And the reason that they were still being paid out was because no one even knew that they were missing. Dorothea picked her victims very well. She would pick people that didn't have much family, people that, didn't have anyone checking on them, didn't have people calling the police if they went missing. By day 5 of the investigation, there was still no sign of Dorothea Puente, and at this point it was pretty much international news. This was a huge case. 7 bodies had just been found in the garden of a home, and the suspected murderer is on the loose somewhere. It was on news stations in Europe, in Asia. There were reporters flying in from all corners of the globe to come to this house and report outside the house as this whole investigation was going on inside. They were getting videos of the CSI team recovering certain things from the garden. And as the case was gaining this much attention, it was inevitable that the news was going to end up getting back to Everson Gilmour's family, who of course recognised the name Dorothea Puente as their father's new wife. And of course they were very worried, so they called the Sacramento police and they just said, okay, this woman that is suspected of 7 murders is our father's wife, and we just want to know if he's okay. But of course, there really wasn't much that they could do at this point. They hadn't seen him or spoken to him just yet, and none of the bodies were identified yet, so they just had to tell his family that they would keep a lookout and they'd keep them updated. That same evening, police finally got their first lead on where Dorothea Puente could be right at that moment. It was from a man who believed that he'd been speaking with her the night before in a bar. He thought that Dorothea had looked familiar the whole time that he was speaking to her, but it was when the conversation changed to his government checks and kind of how much money he was receiving on benefits that it all clicked in his head, and he realised that this was the woman that he'd seen on the news. But luckily, at this point, Dorothea had already shared with this man where she was staying at that moment in time. She'd told him that she was staying in a motel just outside of Sacramento, and so police went straight there to arrest her. When she answered the door to police, she originally gave a fake name, and of course police weren't buying it at all, and so they asked to see some form of ID, which she obviously couldn't provide. And so instead of resisting or coming up with a cover story, she just said, okay, I'm Dorothea Puente, and they arrested her and took her to the police station. Meanwhile, at this point, autopsies were finally beginning on all of the bodies and all of the different materials and stuff that were found in the garden. Now, if you remember, one of the first things they found in that first hole, before they even found a body, they found 2 pieces of material. One that was kind of like a blouse, nightgown type material, and one that seemed more leather-like. As they began looking at this leather-like material under a microscope, they realised that it actually wasn't leather at all. It was human flesh that had fallen from the bone and then just gotten really tough over time. Pathologists knew that the autopsies of the full bodies were going to be really hard to do because of how decomposed the bodies were. It was going to be really hard to identify who was who, what they died of. However, there was one body that was going to be pretty easy to identify. It was the 4th one recovered from the yard, a middle-aged male that was identified using his tattoos. This one was Benjamin Fink, the man that was in the boarding house due to his alcoholism, the man that Dorothea had murdered one night when he was particularly rowdy at the dinner table. 2 of the bodies that were recovered actually had salvageable fingerprints or footprints or whatever, so they were easy to identify as Dorothy Miller and Burt Montoya. The other bodies were slowly identified one by one over the course of the rest of the investigation. Of course, the remaining 4 being Vera Faye Martin, James Gallup, Betty Palmer, and Leona Carpenter. But of course, just because these were the only bodies found in the backyard of the boarding house, that doesn't mean that they're Dorothea's only victims. She could have had other victims that she'd just disposed of their bodies elsewhere, and so police had a plan. And they just asked all of these police departments to look through any unsolved murders that they had over the past however many years and just see if any of the characteristics line up with these 7. And sure enough, one department did get in contact with them and said that they had an unidentified, unsolved murder from 1986. This was the unidentified, very decomposed body of an elderly male that had been wrapped up and left in a wooden box by a river. And it was at this point in the investigation that that body could finally be identified as that of Everson Gilmouth, and that part of the case was put to rest. And it was around this same time that Ruth Monroe's family once again got in contact with police, begging them to reopen the case of their mother's death. They'd ruled it a suicide. However, this woman died of a drug overdose under the care of Dorothea Puente, and now they had 7 other people that had also died of those same circumstances. So it was obvious that this probably wasn't a suicide. So finally, police began taking Ruth Monroe's death seriously. The case was reopened, they looked at all the information, all the evidence, and finally, Ruth Monroe was considered one of Dorothea Puente'S murder victims. This was finally ruled a murder. Altogether, Dorothea was to be put on trial for 9 different murders, 7 of which were her tenants that I just ran through, plus her ex-fiancé Everson Gilmouth and her best friend Ruth Monroe. The trial was due to begin in 1990, but it didn't actually end up happening until 1993 due to loads of different reasons, like there was a venue change because obviously this case was so high profile and so widely reported on that the amount of press, like once the press found out where the trial was going to be held, they all flocked there and made it unsafe, so they had to change venues secretly. Before the trial, Dorothea was offered a plea bargain. They said to her, look, if you plead guilty to all of these murders, then you will get life in prison, but she didn't have to be tried for the death penalty. So the plea deal is basically saying, do you want guaranteed life in prison but you keep your life, or do you want to try and get a lower sentence but potentially lose your life? And Dorothea chose that second option. She wanted to plead not guilty because she thought that she could get away with a lot lower sentence than life in prison. And so the trial went ahead in summer of 1993. It was a relatively tricky trial to navigate because no one had actually seen or heard or had any evidence of Dorothea actually killing these people. And even though their causes of death couldn't be determined through their autopsies due to the level of decomposition, the fact that the bodies were wrapped up and then, put in holes in the ground, they hadn't done that to themselves. This was obvious homicide. But that is exactly where Dorothea's legal team kind of wedged their way in. They couldn't deny that Dorothea had stolen the money from her tenants because her name was on all the checks. They could barely even deny the fact that she'd buried them in the yard due to those parolees digging the holes in the yard, and of course the fact that this was her property. She didn't own it, but she rented that house. So who else is going to bury bodies on your property, Even though no one had actually seen physically with their own 2 eyes Dorothea Puente burying bodies on her own land, there was still too much circumstantial evidence to even try to argue it. Like, they just kind of had to accept the fact that that is what happened. So the way that the defence went at it was, Dorothea buried these bodies on her own land, but she didn't kill them. They said that all of those tenants, all of those bodies that were buried, had died of natural causes, be it, from their conditions or alcoholism. They said that they all died, but Dorothea didn't murder them. However, she felt the need to hide these bodies because she knew that she was running an illegal boarding house. So if she was to call a coroner to come and pick up this body from the house, she would then have to explain that they were one of her tenants at her boarding house. Police would then find out that she was running an illegal boarding house, which was against her probation, which would then put her back in prison. She said that she knew that what she was doing was wrong. She knew it was wrong, but in order to keep her job, to keep her business, she just had to take care of disposing of the bodies herself rather than do it the official legal way of getting a coroner to come and take the body away. And this put the prosecution in a very sticky situation because how do they argue that? That's a very believable story, and because the bodies were so badly decomposed that their cause of death couldn't be identified, how do you say that they were murdered? They could well have died of natural causes, but we'll never know. But there was one piece of evidence that pointed to the fact that Dorothea was drugging all of these people, and that was the fact that they actually all had Dalmane in their system when they were killed. Dalmane being that sedative drug that I said she liked to use, the one that is believed to have killed Ben Fink. Dorothea argued that she gave it to all of her tenants because it helped them sleep, it was a very common drug. However, something seemed off about that to the court. Looking back through medical records of both hers and her tenants, the prosecution found that Dorothea Puente, in total, had been prescribed somewhere near 1,000 pills of Dalmane in the time that she had her boarding house, which is an insane amount. Even if they were being used for their intended purpose every single night, which they're not supposed to be because they build up in your system, that would still be an excessive amount. That would still be too many for her to have possibly used. After hearing over 150 witness statements and enduring over 50 days of this trial, the jury finally went to deliberate. However, it wouldn't be so straightforward because not all of them believed that Dorothea was guilty. It took the jury over 6 months of deliberation, which is the longest in US history, for them to finally come to a messy verdict. They didn't even come to a solid verdict. Bear in mind, in these kind of videos, you've heard me say things like, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury came back. 6 months. 6 whole entire months, half a year. 11 members of the jury believed that Dorothea was guilty. However, there was one. The final 12th member of the jury just wasn't convinced that she was guilty. They couldn't all agree on the different charges that they would give her for the different victims. Of course, 9 victims, and there's so many different options. There's first degree, second degree, third, manslaughter, whatever. And they all have to agree on a charge for each victim, which of course is going to be very hard. It's going to take a lot of debate and discussion and conversation. Anyway, finally, after 6 months, the jury came back and they shared exactly what they thought Dorothea was guilty of and for what victim. They found Dorothea Puente guilty of the first-degree murder of Dorothy Miller and Benjamin Fink. They also decided that she was guilty of second-degree murder in the case of Leona Carpenter. However, the other 6 murders were all declared a mistrial. And I believe that was because the 12th juror, the one that, was persuaded against his will to agree to those 3, said that he wasn't going to deliberate any further. He was like, fine, okay, I'll agree with you guys for those 3, but, that's all you're getting out of me. But for those 3 murders that they did find her guilty of, Dorothea Puente was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury then went back to deliberate whether she would get the death penalty or not. However, they came back deadlocked. They just couldn't decide, and so it went to the judge, who decided that life in prison was enough for Dorothea. Dorothea Puente spent the rest of her life in a prison in Chowchilla, and during her time she had a lot of pen pals on the outside who were desperate to speak to an infamous serial killer. In 2004, one of these pen pals actually helped Dorothea write a book from inside prison. Because she was an avid cook, she really liked cooking, this guy who had been writing to her said, look, send me loads of recipes, loads of your favourite recipes that you've made during your life, and he would make them into a cookbook and get it published. This guy's name was Shane Bugbee, and he successfully got this cookbook published for her, and it's still available to buy, just on Amazon or whatever. It's called Cooking with a Serial Killer, Recipes from Dorothea Puente. Eventually, on March 27th of 2011, Dorothea Helen Puente passed away, still in prison, from natural causes, aged 82. After the case, more specifically after the murder of Burt Montoya, Judy Moyes had to quit her work as a social worker. Well, she wasn't a social worker, she was a street counsellor helping the homeless, and that meant that she worked with people like Burt every single day, and she just found it way too triggering knowing that she'd failed someone in the past. I personally don't think she failed him. She wasn't supposed to know, but that's how she felt. She had a lot of guilt due to what happened to Burt Montoya. Since the murders, the house, 1426 F Street, remained empty for a long, long time because, of course, no one really wants to buy and live in a house that so many people have died in. That was until 2011 when Tom and Barbara Holmes were house searching in the area and 1426 caught their eye. They were originally looking to buy the house next door when they saw 1426 and they were like, can we view that one? Like, is that one available? And the real estate agent said, well, yeah, it's available, but like, do you know its history? Do you really want to do that? And Tom and Barbara, they weren't from the area, so they didn't know. And the real estate agent explained it all to them, but it didn't faze them. And they still wanted to go and look around. And eventually they purchased that house. To them, the house was beautiful. It served all of their needs. Their whole mindset on living in this house is, well, the house is innocent. The house didn't do anything. The house didn't commit the murders. It was simply a vessel where this all took place, but the house itself doesn't deserve to be treated like that, you know? So the two of them snatched it up and moved in, and, you know, everyone in the area was quite intrigued about this new couple that had moved into the neighbourhood, moved into the House of Horrors in the neighbourhood, and people would always go and stand outside the house and look in, and it's, you know, quite a dark tourist attraction, things like that always are. And so Tom and Barbara decided to have a sense of humour about the whole thing, and they decorated the garden with lots of little jokes referring to the murders. They put a mannequin out on the porch that they dress in a red coat because that's what she was wearing in those famous pictures where she went out for a coffee. They've put a grey-haired wig on her. Sometimes they put a shovel in her hands. They put a purse around her arm, and sometimes they leave getaway money in there. There's signs up around the garden saying things like trespassers will be drugged and buried in the yard. There's another one saying please don't park on the driveway. The ghosts like to get out at night and terrorise the neighbourhood. That one I don't think is too bad, but that first one. Like I said, people would stop outside the house and stare in, and they would say a lot of things, and they would talk to Tom and Barbara and be like, how can you live in there? And all of this kind of made Tom and Barbara quite upset. So the two of them decided to make and put up a plaque outside that said, it was that awful, awful woman that did it. Don't blame me. Signed, the house. They have a similar sign that says, it was that crazy bitch that did it. Not me. Signed, the house. But they moved that one inside because of the language. There's another sign in the garden that says, keep out from under the grass, referring to, of course, the buried bodies. Surprisingly, they've actually kept all of the original hardwood flooring in the house, which I find rather strange, considering in the death room, sometimes bodies would be left in there so long that bodily fluids would literally seep into the wood. The couple themselves don't believe that the house is haunted. It's not that they're non-believers. They do believe in the paranormal, or they would like to believe in the paranormal. It's just that they personally haven't seen or heard or experienced anything in that house. Although Barbara's elderly mother that once lived with them does believe that the house is haunted, and she has a couple of stories actually. She recalls one night she went to bed as normal, and then she woke up in the middle of the night to the light switching on in the room. And when she opened her eyes, she recalled seeing a woman pacing around the room, and it was as if she was looking for something. And then this woman came right up to her, got right in her face, and leant in so far that her eye was right in front of Barbara's mother's eye. She just stayed there for a while, she didn't say a word, and then she got up and left the room. This woman was wearing dark black lipstick, and she would smile a lot, but Barbara's mother somehow knew that she didn't like her. Like, the ghost, this woman, didn't like her being there. She just got this feeling. Another time, Barbara's mother was walking from the hallway into her bedroom when she stopped in the doorway just out of paralysing fear. For some reason, she was just really scared to enter her bedroom. And because of this feeling, she decided to peer into her bedroom, not walk in, like lean in. And that was when she saw a really big orange orb floating around in front of the window, like the size of your fist. Other than that, there's been no more activity at that house. The house has been blessed by priests and cleansed and whatever several times by several different people. And I suppose it's up to you what you believe in terms of paranormal activity and ghosts. But yeah, that completes this case. That completes the 3-part series. Thank you so much for watching it. Thank you so much for being so patient with me between uploads. If you did enjoy this series, make sure you leave a big thumbs up and subscribe down below for more, because I'm going to start working on my next case as soon as this one's uploaded. So thank you so much to all of my channel members in tiers 1 and 2 for their continued support with the channel, and to my tier 2 members for their help in deciding the cases that I cover. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you want to subscribe to my channel, here's a little clicky thing. If you want to subscribe to my second channel, I do comedy content over there and I will be posting very soon. Click there. And here is a playlist of a bunch of other videos if you want to watch another one. Bye!